Hi everybody, welcome to the V&A. My name is Mia Harris, I'm the senior producer as part of the residencies team. I want to thank you all for coming to Untold History of Heels. There's going to be a little bit of filming during the event today and a little bit of photography. And just letting you know that the fire exits are just this end and this end of the room in case of any emergencies. So I'm just going to talk about the structure of the event today. So we're just going to start off with a lecture with Luca Bosani, who is the current artist in resident at the V&A, followed by a Q&A, an in-conversation with curator and historian in queer experience and theory, and that's with Will Ballantyne-Reid. And then we're going to close at 3:15 with a performance activation wearing unidentified performing objects with Conn Williams and Rafael Escardo. After the lecture, you're really welcome to go in the studio. I know some of you have been in already, but the studio, if you haven't been in, is just out of this door and then up the corridor. So you're very welcome to come, and Luca will be in there after the lecture as well, so you can chat and ask some questions. So I'd like to give a really warm welcome to Luca Bosani.
Hello. Hi, everyone. How you doing? Great to see you here. So, welcome to the Untold History of Heels. At the V&A, I've been focusing on shoes and particularly on heels. And I've been studying the history of heels in different ways and through different lenses. And I've put together today a presentation. Lecture is going to be quite short. Going to be quite a lot of information. We're going to go through it together. And I started this presentation adding 4 key words: gender, class, sexuality, and power. These are different themes and concepts that are present in the history of heels, but they do change according to the time. They change according to the situation and conditions and the politics of the time. But first of all, let's start from the origin. Are you familiar with this? Have you ever seen it before? No? Many no's. So it's very similar to this one. So this one is a Persian riding boot, but also has been identified by historians as the first pair of heels. They were made for men, for soldiers, from the cavalry of the Persian Empire. This heel was functional, and its function was to hold the stirrups and to support the riding of the horses. But then, how does this heel comes to Europe and comes to the Western world? So there's different versions of it, but the one that is the most accredited is that some diplomats from the Persian Empire were sent to Europe for political reasons, to just meet. And the Europeans got fascinated by this type of shoes and decided to start to make some similar shoes. So here we see some mules, and here we have some slap sole shoes. We have always the ears on the top, we have the provenance on the bottom, and some more information. At this time, heels didn't have a gender. They were both for men and for women. For example, this shoe was quite common, and he had this shape because it protected the wearer from sinking into the mud. And it was called slap shoe because of the sound provoked by the walking, because of the slapping of the heel on the wooden part. Again, it was both for male and females. Here we have a piece from Italy in the V&A collection of mules. And we see here a red heel. the red heels start to appear in different ways. And we have a quite kind of limited understanding of what is a red heel, I think, somehow, in contemporary times. But if we look back, we find heels on a lot of men, aristocratic men, people in power. So the first heel I presented you was a heel that was supporting somehow and enhancing the capabilities of a rider of a cavalry or of a horse. So he had a war/power kind of direction. This one instead had more like an aristocratic kind of power. It talks about class. And this is King Louis XIV, portrayed by Hyacinthe Rigaud, and the portrait is from 1701. But Louis XIV was was a king for a long, long time. And one of the things he introduced were red heels. This is a red heel for men. It's a shoe, very tall. The taller, the redder, the more important was the wearer, more aristocratic, closer to the king. We have also an example from a pair of boy shoes, again from France. And we can see how it is decorated and quite embellished and soft. So this type of decoration and treatment on a shoe is very rare nowadays, or is conceived apart from certain circles, apart from queer circles or non-binary circles. This would be a very feminine kind of thing. At the time, this was a boy shoe of a very aristocratic, well-placed in society. I'm going to do a little jump backwards. If you see the years, we're talking about 1580, 1620. And we have a pair of Chopins, also called pantopoles, also called pianelle, depending from different places. They are from Spain, they are from Venice. Specifically from Venice, they were very, very important. So you can see the height and the material changing. So this one is a bit more, let's say, not as aristocratic as this one. It's not as fancy. But the Chopins have a very interesting story. They were initially used by prostitutes in order to attract attention and clients. And then eventually they arrived at court, and the aristocratic women were fascinated by these shoes and decided to adopt them. So they change from one purpose to another, and they become the ultimate kind of tool to show how relevant and special you are. Because you can wear these shoes, you can have people helping you wearing the shoes and walk with you, or you can just even have the luxury of standing on them and be looked at. So I guess maybe it's a good point to ask you, what is this? Is it a shoe? Is it a sculpture? Is it a tool? Is it a political tool? What's the role of this, for example? This is something I've been thinking about throughout the residency. But also I've been looking to whatever kind of heel, which kind of heel the population that is not aristocratic would wear. Many historians don't consider this as a heel. They consider it only as a mud skipper. But it elevates the foot from the ground. And this is a pair of patterns which a very common everyday person could wear to not get their feet into the mud. So they were quite special type of shoes at the time. And they continue. Actually, we're arriving to the 1740, which is a very, very key pivotal moment in history. But before that, this is the fancy version of the aristocrats of what we've seen before. We see a silk heel, we see very delicate colors, and we see the patterns. So they have this covering that protects them from the mud, but protects also the shoe from being damaged. I say pivotal moment because, as you can see, the style starts to become quite peculiar. Materials start to become silk, they become soft, there's patterns, there's colors. These are all shoes for women. What happens is that, in fact, in the 1740, around 1740, men stop wearing the heels. And they go towards something a bit more like this: utilitarian, intellectual, following the Enlightenment. It's not anymore like about frills and colors. It becomes about other. The man is busy. The man needs to work, right? So that's what happens. Some people consider this a heel. I don't. I think this is a heel. So for this reason, I decided to study this heel a little bit more. Is a heel for women again, and you can see all the traits I just described before. And here we can see it in 3D. So I had the opportunity to come in contact with the collection of the V&A, specifically with this work, and I was able to make a 3D scan with the V&A team, with Kira. And here we can see all the details of how it is made, the sole, the wooden parts, and it's quite phenomenal. And I thought it was like really important to have access to this type of shoe, which really marks the time in which somehow binaries in footwear become very clear. And I'm not saying this is a good thing. Actually, it's quite critical. But that's what happens. This might seem not related, but these are the covering of the ones I've just 3D scanned, just to show you how they were doing this kind of. The roads were not roads, the mud was everywhere, and so they had to find ways to get the shoes clean. Jumping in another country and complete a different style, we're going to go on the cab from Egypt, made of wood and mother of pearl inlay. Very tall. These were used in baths, and specifically by aristocratic women. Again, we have privilege, we have gender, we have class, to not get their feet wet with the dirty waters in the baths. All of this are for the museum, from the V&A Museum. Not all the images are from the V&A Museum, but many. So I've tried to tell this story through what the collection provides, but you can see the provenance. So if you see somewhere else, there are also sometimes some objects that are not from the V&A. But I tried from this period onwards to stay with the V&A as much as I could. So this is fantastic again, details. Then I want to go to China. Let's travel to China, and we're not going to talk about foot binding, which is also quite critical practice they had, but we talk about something different. We talk about Manchu horse hoof shoes. They are very difficult to walk with, quite unstable, again decorated, kind of cute. Their role was to enhance the height of the wearer. So women could look taller, slimmer, and be more attractive to the man's gaze. So again, we have this kind of binary playing in the background and in the foreground at the same time. And I guess we come back to England and we come back to Europe, because it happened something that in the Regency era, as I was saying before about the Enlightenment, not only men stopped wearing heels, but also women stopped wearing heels. So there are very, very small heels during the Regency era, which is just before the Victorian era. But in the Victorian era is where the heel, as we know it, really comes through. And here we can see in the 1886, 1887, a very delicate, kind of sensual type of shoe. Again, in this case for women. Sort of in the idea of the time, underlining feminine traits and qualities, but also we have the rising of erotic photography and also fetish. So we have erotic photography with these shoes. Also with these ones are quite exaggerated, where your feet is changed and your shape is changed. And this sexualization, hypersexualization of the shoe lead us to the one that we all know, the stiletto, the red stiletto. If you look at the emoji on your smartphone, then you're going to have the stiletto, of course. It's like it becomes this sort of epitome of like femininity and becomes this thing. and often is used also in drag performance, for example, to subvert the codes. But on another track, we have something else happening in these years. In my opinion, quite a bit more interesting. These are the cork heels by Salvatore Ferragamo, are the very first heels made of cork. Cork was a poor material at the time. It was in between wars that this happened in 1938. And so they needed to find a way to make these heels. So they found a way to make it with cork. Cork became a very important element and material in the future of the shoes. I'm sure that a good percentage of you might have tried a cork shoe. Could be a slipper, could be a sandal or anything. So it's very, very common, or at least you've seen it. So this is very important in the history of heels, is also very beautiful. But this resembles something that we can see here, the platform. So I guess for me, this part is really important because we have, in the 1970s, after 230 years, from the 1740 to the 1970, men, they were not, let's say, allowed or, they were not invited or they were not collectively, they were not wearing heels. That's the bottom line. But not because they didn't want to necessarily. It was like the code, the binary code in the society would not allow them to be accepted if they would be wearing something feminine like heels. So they would have to be relegated to entertainment or, in the darkness, in some kind of dark place that you're not be seen. So this is really important for me that globally, somehow, we have the heels for men again. We have color, we have fun, we have play. And we really have like a big change in the worldviews. In the 70s, I'm also romanticizing the 70s. Take it, I'm romanticizing. There were horrible things happening. But let me romanticize it a little bit, because I think there were some great ideas. There were ideas of like, first of all, feminism was coming very strong, was growing as a movement. We had a movement for equality in terms of race, in terms of gender. We started to have also some more reliable politics somehow. We had also very ambitious eco projects. We had architecture, we had the design. Everything was flourishing. Contemporary art really flourished in the 70s as well. It didn't really exist before. So it was a very special period for me, where it kind of felt like you could be whoever you want to be. You are allowed to dream. And on that note, these are the shoes from Elton John. Also, Bowie used to wear this type of shoes. The figures like Grace Jones appeared in this kind of time. Marvin Gaye was using this kind of platform boots. For me, these shoes are an opportunity to dream, to bring these ideas of creativity, fluidity, inclusivity, fun, to bring at the forefront, to queering what has been told that shoes can be, but ultimately what we can be. This is the point. So here we have boots from the Kiss. Of course, we have these kind of bands coming up. Lovely shoes from Kansai Yamamoto, the dress Bowie, the very famous dress with the stripes. And then probably my favorite item in the collection. I guess you can guess why. It's colorful, it's fun, it's playful, it's open. I love it. And then just to wrap up my presentation, here we have the platform shoes from Vivienne Westwood from 1993, that are also in the Naomi exhibition at the museum where Naomi fell from in a live runway. And then we have Manolo Blahnik, which for me is really like, what is this? And then, just like, is it a shoe or something else? Up for you to tell. And by the way, it's been made 5 kilometers away from my own town. It's a very tiny place in the north of Italy. So it's really exciting. Throughout the V&A, it's worth to say I was able to do some research trips. One in my hometown where I connected with the roots of my grandfather that used to be a shoemaker. And I got to know that a lot of people in my family, up to 3 generations, are all shoemakers. I also had the opportunity to go to Northampton and to talk with Rebecca Shawcross, which is one of the most prepared person, one of the best historians about shoes, focusing on shoes in the world. So amazing. So this comes out from all of this kind of journeys, and of course from a lot of research on my own as well. But let's close the presentation with the last images, because we're going to expand with Will in a minute in a Q&A. This is Noritaka Tatehana, and these are some Geta shoes. I didn't put some traditional Geta shoes, but I wanted to kind of give at least a connection, because also we have these fantastic wooden shoes in Japan, and this is a very interesting take, contemporary take from a Japanese artist. Then I have to come to McQueen, 2010, Armadillo, Titanic, and Alien. They're just incredible, and I think they speak for themselves. And now I'm really coming to the last two, and they're both from Noritaka Tatehana. And I want to close this presentation as this is, I decided to call it Untold History of Heels because there are many things that we don't know about the history of heels. For example, all this gender swapping and all these elements. But also, there are so many ways to tell this story. So I just want to say this is my take on a very broad history. And I thought it was very interesting to finish with this, which is a shoe without a heel. This was the first time it was made in 2014. Lady Gaga wore it and other important singers and artists. And then there's also this one, again, in the V&A Museum, which is more or less the same shoe, but is a bit more refined. And yeah, I guess it's a great place to close the presentation and a history of heels, but without a heel. Nice. So now we're going to have a Q&A with our guest, Will. And it's such an honor to have you. And please join us over here.
Thank you so much, Luca. That was fascinating. And thank you all for being here. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions about specific examples that you reference. I wanted to start jumping off from the presentation by asking you what has maybe surprised you the most in your research whilst you've been at the V&A.
It's a great question. Initially, a few things that surprised me. One point is quite interesting that Rebecca Shawcross brought up when I was in Northampton. It's like we have these very first heels are from around 16th century, from the Persian riding boots. And Rebecca was saying, how is it possible that there are no earlier heels than that? How do we... So I guess somehow what is really I guess it's a non-discovery, what surprised me. The fact that we probably just scratched the surface of this history, or what it really is. I would say this was a surprise. But also on a more lighter and more simple note, it was a big surprise to find the boot, the colorful one from the 70s that I said is my favorite. It never showed up in my research. I searched a lot in the collection of the V&A, on the engine, asking with people, asking with staff. And then eventually, it was like maybe 3 weeks ago, and this shoe popped up, and I was like, whoa, I gotta print it. I gotta do it. So I was really surprised I didn't find it before.
To go back in terms of your research, because this is a research that even before the residency, you've been undertaking for years in very different formats. I wanted to kind of go back to the beginning of, you mentioned your grandfather, who was a shoemaker, and revealing to yourself that actually this is kind of in your blood and in your family for generations. And what were your first memories of the shoe as an object, and your memories of your grandfather's space?
Yeah, my grandfather had a workshop in the back of his house, and previously he was working in different places, but then towards the end of his life, moved to this back sort of area as a workshop. And I remember being very, very young and like a child, 4 years old, 5 years old, and going inside and like smelling the glue. There's this very particular contact glue that is used to make shoes, and which is so interesting because now I'm doing some traditional shoes for my work as well, and now I'm smelling the same. Smell goes really back in time. And then I also remember his tools, and I remember the leather. Also, I remember bits, because really we see shoes when they're completed, but they're made of so many little parts. So when I was young, of course I couldn't, I was a child, I couldn't sort of put the puzzle together, but I remember the pieces of the puzzle.
And was your interest in that kind of structure and the assemblage and the kind of construction, or was it more in what the shoes represented and the kind of that atmosphere of the workshop?
For me, that was a bit like a magical place. So I would just go and, the smell, it's just like the machineries. He had quite big machinery at some point. So I was just like a bit of a retreat from, because also towards the end of his life, he was getting older, so no one was really using that much, the laboratory, the workshop. We call it laboratory, workshop. So there was this kind of like half abandoned, a bit of like spider webs and things like that.
So I think I prefer laboratorio as a word for it. I think even going into your studio here, it has that kind of mad scientist lab atmosphere in the best way. And it's interesting that I know shoes as a kind of object in the UPOs have existed in your practice right back to kind of your master's at the Royal College of Art, and specifically with this kind of interest in reimagining masculinities. And so the fact that there is this route back to your grandfather and this kind of male patriarch is a kind of interesting launch pad for that. I wonder, at what point did the kind of shoe reveal itself to you as something that you could use to explore gender in this way?
Yeah, well, some of my early memories of shoes might be this similar to many other people. You are maybe 12 or something, or 10, and capitalism running strong. You see the Foot Locker, and you're like, I want to get that Nike that costs, at the time was 200,000 lire, which was something about 150 euro. And you're like, and kind of like, but then I think I was seduced by the advertising and the promises. Particularly, I was seduced by the promises of football boots. If you get these football boots, you're going to run faster. You're going to play better. You're going to jump high, all these things. So there was this kind of magic around the shoe, but actually they just wanted to sell it to you. So I started there. But then, when I was growing, and then I used to play football for a long time, and then I realized when I started to play with adults, the world of adults was very different from my world. Especially, it was very binary, it was very violent. A friend of mine almost lost his life on a football pitch a few years after. It's very competitive, it's very toxic. There's a lot of like toxic masculinity going on. And so I felt initially in the football sort of realm, quite isolated and not understood, but also later also with my friends from my hometown. And so all this idea of this kind of masculinity were not for me. And so I guess being in a small town, still having a quite lovely family, but living in this very conservative, like patriarchal, Catholic place, I guess something needed to be broken. And yeah, and then art came into the game, and I moved to London, and
because there's
the rest
something
is history.
There's something in that kind of image of the footballer and being on the pitch, of that kind of puffing out the chest and this way to kind of perform machismo and the bravado and all these different codes. And it's kind of interesting with the shoe as this object that I think is one of kind of those few things, even within the fashion language, where shoes kind of change the entire body, how you stand, your posture, how you move, how fast you move or how slow you move. And obviously within your performances, there's a kind of resonance there. So I wonder with your UPOs, and if you can maybe talk a bit more about the UPOs as well, but with the UPOs, how do you want your performers to kind of feel? And what are you trying to bring to kind of the scene with those objects?
Yeah. I started my journey, as I was saying before, like something needed to be broken. So I just been trying to undo masculinity, like undoing all the toxic sort of culturally embedded into, sexism. And it goes across the board. It's sexism, racism, self-inflicted kind of limitations and stereotypes, and like they come from all over the places. And I think if you're not aware or you're not actively trying to undoing yourself, you'll be made by others. So I think this was really the challenge. And I guess coming from that background where football was very important, and you have your groups of friends which are generally male, most of them, and kind of like breaking this kind of like mold, I decided to really tackle these ideas of masculinity and hypermasculinity, bringing it to a point of like irony and absurdity. So I created, for example, banana duels, where instead of like guns, they had bananas, but they had very serious routines. And then these two contenders, male contenders, had this ridiculous task. But it was something like, I was really trying to strike the chord of the idea of male performativity and the danger that male performativity brings, definitely to all the other genders, but also to themselves. And so I guess that was like the starting point for developing non-coded, later on, non-coded behaviors, non-coded selves, non-coded artworks, non-coded environments, to not only kind of take down something, but then to construct. So I guess I started constructing layer by layer.
Kind of breaking through those boundaries and celebrating the fluidity of these objects, which I think kind of connects obviously to your exploration of queerness in such an interesting way, and something we spoke about before. Because for me, the shoes there at once, there's something really seductive about them and something super kind of tactile and sensorial, but also something frightening about them or threatening with the tentacles and the spikes and the kind of a certain like harshness to their shape. And so I wondered kind of what part that slipperiness plays for you. And we kind of talked about in nature how with certain animals will kind of change their presentation, or even plants will change their presentation, either to kind of attract mates or to defend against predators. And that it's kind of not a binary, but a duality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nature is wonderful, and we can see all the sort of like different like creatures that has maybe both genders, or they can swap gender, or we see all the queer behavior. I mean, it's such a fluid and joyous and colorful kind of world. Just to look at it, just to look at it, even in a nice documentary, just to be inspired is already amazing. But I guess there are certain things that I've been looking particularly in my works, and looking at nature and thinking about fluidity, or maybe also something that can be ambivalent, but not in a negative connotation, in a connotation of more meanings than one. And I guess I've been looking a lot at horns, for example, initially, but then I've also been looking about, for example, other animals. That's like certain frogs. They have a very bright color, and that signifies they are poisonous, but they're not meant to poison. I mean, they're not going around to purposely poison someone else. They're just defending themselves. And you have also a lot of birds that do similar kind of, they use their plumage in certain ways to just kind of, to protect themselves. So in my work, these are not supposed to be something that is made to attack someone else. It's made rather to defend the wearer. And in say so, I underlined constant observance and like surveillance, and often violence, direct or indirect, that non-conforming people receive in the street and in many places. And I say non-conforming because I want to open up to anyone that doesn't really sort of fit these boxes that I don't know who created them really. So it's like there's something about like, protecting a very precious identity, or like trying to, just protect yourself from the word.
I think that for me, there's a resonance there with kind of drag culture and self-expression in that way. And I think that's something, having known your practice for a few years, that's something interesting, that even that image of the footballer or the inspector in different works, there's always been this kind of understanding of the drag aspect of that performance. And I wonder if that's something that you feel with these as well, and with the performances themselves, if it is a reference.
Yeah, that's quite layered question. I think that identity is very flexible, and something can be molded. And I think throughout my practice, I have been trying to, also just throughout my daily life. I remember when I was in like my first year in university, I was like 20. I remember I would have few outfits. One was a rapper, one was the rock, one was the relaxed with the jumpsuit, one was, what was he? I don't remember anymore. The basketball player. So I had all this many, and I remember like a friend of mine said, I don't understand you. I'm like, but the thing is, for me, it's nice to understand. It's just an expression. And I guess what I'm trying to do when maybe I'm an investigator, I'm trying to release a certain type of like creativity, or to aid certain type of projects that might need me to be an investigator. Or maybe other projects might need me to be like a personal trainer, which maybe you haven't seen this one. But I've done like a couple of videos with me as a personal trainer, taking the piss of these hyper masculine personal trainers. So I think it depends from what it is, and it ultimately always tends to the liberation. And so often, something you wear can actually be a tool to liberate something inside of you that might be hidden, or you don't know where it is. And then when you wear something, that will come out. So I guess that could be the ultimate goal of these objects, is to liberate something, or even to just make us dream when we look at them. What could I be if I wear this? What does it happen to me? Which kind of transformation am I going to experience?
And in terms of your lecture and this untold history kind of finishing as it does in almost the present day, I wonder kind of where you feel we're at culturally in terms of the heel and in terms of those kind of how that connects to binaries or kind of codes and traditions.
Yeah, somehow, like I've highlighted so much the 70s, because if we do think about genderless shoes, I think the 70s are the period in which we're really the closest to what could have been a genderless shoe. And I say so not because there are designs, of course, of genderless shoes now, but I'm talking about the scope. I'm talking about a random person from, I don't know, Nottingham or Norwich or whatever, wear the heels and go home, wear something like this, go home. Today probably is an issue, but maybe 50 years ago it's just going to dance. So I guess in that case we didn't progress that much in terms of the heels, but I think we do progress in other ways. I think we have a lot of queer theory, we have a lot of awareness, we have internet that allow us to know a lot of things, and we have small kind of niche brands or artists that do genderless heels, and they're really lovely. We also have a lot of 3D printed shoes lately, which are quite interesting. So there are different things happening, but we don't have that kind of large scale, like presence of the platform shoe in the case and the heel on men. I think we went a little bit backwards as a society, as a wide society.
The availability of
just a little, yeah.
Returning just to kind of how you were talking about color and kind of making very specific decisions about the construction of the shoes, I wondered if you could talk a bit more just about the actual process of creating these UPOs and kind of from source materials to sourcing the shoes themselves. I know you're also a collector of shoes alongside kind of the work you make out of them. So if you could just talk about, that actual kind of practical production of it.
Yeah, of course. I'm just sort of laughing to myself because I've just been so silly that I thought I could invent something that didn't exist before. And so I just started to create what I was calling it 8 years ago, sculpture shoes, with absolutely no idea what I was doing. So really I was just like finding materials and finding ways. And then I think there's been a lot of this like silly / presumptuous idea that I can create something and I can make a method that will stick through the time. But I think I actually understood that if you are persistent enough, even if your idea is really odd and really unlikely, you might be able to find something interesting. So I think I'm like, I know a bit more, a lot of, like, for example, I studied wood carving as part of the residency. So I'm making some heels made of wood. I've also studied traditional shoemaking, so I've been making a pair in leather and everything. Most of these recent shoes, they start from an existing shoe, particularly from vintage shoes. I'm very interested in this idea of reclaiming this energy, and not reclaiming, like activating this energy from the 70s and like instill it into the creation. So they are, for example, this one are from the 80s. And then you can see in my studio many more. We have here other ones. So they kind of like have shoes that already have a history, and then I add something to this history. I'm in conversation with the history. And I've been switching from a more like maybe productio kind of quite smooth finish to something more rough that shows the process. So I guess now I'm doing this type of works. I mean, it's hard to describe because the point is that you don't really know what you're looking at, and there's so many layers, and it can be one thing and can be one another, and there's a lot of like freedom into what I do now. So there is a history, but there's also a complete freedom that I'm trying to kind of put into the work, and fluidity. That's why I don't want to learn. Like I want to learn a craft, but I don't want to apply the craft completely to what I do. I want to still mess it up.
I think that's so interesting. I was going to ask that, is there, having done these courses during your residency, and as you said, wood carving, kind of shoemaking in a traditional sense, I wanted to ask you about that resistance. And you've kind of answered that question, but I think that, is such an interesting thing. Having been working in one way for so many years to now, someday it's almost like a back to front kind of learning the rules after the rules. Yeah,
it's just doing the reverse, and somehow like as soon as I learn something, my instinct and my desire is to break the rule. So I think this is kind of like the bottom line of how I work. And I think this can generate a lot of area of action, and unlock creativity. Because if I tell you, no, you cannot draw that way, you have to make the line like that. It's just like, I hate these kind of things. I'm more interested in saying, what is this line telling me? Is this line, what's the point of it? Because I don't care if you made this, super nice drawing. What is it about? So I think there's something about that, the emotion, the feeling, I don't know how to call it, the magic.
Yeah. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about what's next in terms of, I know you're going to be exhibiting here and you have performances coming up, and so kind of, to talk about this next phase of the residency.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're allowed to. If you're allowed to.
No, I am maybe. I can say what's gonna come. It's been like a very exciting year at the museum. It's gone quick. It's not finished yet, but almost. And so we are basically trying to close the year with a bang, I would say, because we are launching a new gallery. It's going to be in the ground floor. Is next to the sculpture gallery. Is going to be the residency gallery. So we are preparing with the other residents, Jackie and Rachel, and all the residency team. We are preparing an exhibition which will last for a long time. We said at least 9 months. So it's going to be a big part of the next year. It's going to be launching in December. But prior to that, well, this will give me a lot of work, so I should not do anything before. But prior to that, I'm also doing. We're also doing collectively with the residency. We are preparing Friday Late, the 25th of October. It's going to be free to attend. We have amazing events. I think we're talking about 12 events. And particularly, I'm presenting a performance, which will be a development of what you're going to see shortly. This is all I can say.
I wonder if we open up to the floor. I'm sure there are so many questions based on Luca's lecture and also just about Luca's practice in general. So, if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Luca. That was a fascinating presentation. So my question specifically has to do with the comfort of shoes of past historical time periods. So virtually every single shoe that you've shown me from the 15, 16, 17, even 1800s looks to be profoundly uncomfortable. So was it a matter, and I mean, these were to be everyday shoes. I mean, with Lady Gaga, we can understand she's also a performance artist, so she does these when she's sort of on stage. But for daily wear, they look heavy and they look torturous, quite frankly. So I was just wondering, did ancient peoples assume that shoes were just naturally uncomfortable and it was something that they accepted as like a byproduct of being alive and trying to not like get their feet dirty? Or how did that work? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, there's an important correlation, especially in contemporary times, between comfort of a shoe and sort of role and use of the shoe. Well, the history is enormous, so it's hard for me to try to talk about all the eras, but there's been in many periods, especially before the 19th century, shoes were not that comfy. They didn't have the same materials, all the sneakers that we have, or this soft kind of cushion, forget about it. So they were much more uncomfortable than today. Regarding the presentation itself, I've been focusing on heels, but also on quite extraordinary and extravagant type of shoes. So they're not all the degrees of how a heel can sort of like scale down, or so there were different eras. For example, as I said, in the Regent era, is somehow the ballerina, what we know as ballerina, were sort of very popular. They were very similar to what we have as ballerina now. They just had a little tiny thing, a tiny heel on the back. So there's been more comfortable shoes throughout the history than the ones I presented. But one thing important to remember is the development of the technology. So I think the shoes we have now are so much more comfortable than many of the past.
Thank you. Carrying on, in fact, from what the young lady was asking, one of the things that I've realized is that when I was younger and doubtless more naive than I am now, I assumed that there was a simple reason that women wore higher heels than men. And that was simply because typically the average man is taller than the average woman, and therefore this is closing the gap. But as I found out more about fashion, and as it were, the politics of fashion, and particularly the gender politics of fashion, thinking and sort of looking, for example, at corsetry, where a major objective of the corsetry, I now believe, is to help men impose their power over women. Do you feel that there are comparisons that can be drawn between that motivation and sometimes some very impractical high heels, which women wore, and generally speaking, men don't?
Yes, there's so many ways to kind of like respond to this question. Because, for example, the first thing that comes to my mind is that for certain people, on a certain train of thought, you would say, what a pain for a woman to wear the heels to look appealing for the men. She has to suffer. You take the same shoe, you put it on another person, and another woman in this case, just to make it binary. But again, I'm not a fan of it. Not the same, a same pair of shoes, same of heels, another woman, and the other woman says, I feel so empowered by my heels. I feel so strong. So as you see, the same exact type of shoe can have a completely different impact. So I think it's very relative, and like depending on who is approaching this certain item and what they're using it for. So yeah, this would be my main sort of response.
Okay.
Good afternoon, and thank you again for sharing this fascinating perspective on the history of heels. My question actually builds on the gentleman's. And if we look at the evolution of heels through a gender lens, I mean, you pointed out that heels sort of started as a shoe worn by men, but then perhaps became more closely associated with women across time. But I guess if we look at the more recent history of women's shoes, we can see that actually women have, there's a much greater diversity of footwear that women have been able to wear over the last 50 years, right? We've been able to sort of reclaim wearing things like, trainers, flats, etc., while still having the flexibility to wear heels. Whereas we're not seeing that same diversity in terms of men's shoes. And we can, think about some of the political or social movements that have contributed to the change in women's footwear across time. I guess from your perspective, what would need to happen for men to be able to reclaim that same freedom and have that same diversity of footwear to choose from sort of a socially acceptable viewpoint?
It's a huge question. I think I can talk about like what I'm trying to do, because when we're talking about these big changes in society, I think we need a lot of heads and a lot of kind of different groups and people kind of driving on the same direction. So I think this would be already a great thing. But talking about like my perspective, I think what I'm trying to do is to show that even with examples that are quite out of the ordinary, is to present alternatives and to say it's okay. It's okay to be a man, or to be a non-binary, or to be queer, or to be whoever you feel to be and wear whatever you feel to be. We need just more examples. So I think I'm trying to give platform to certain identities with platforms. But like, not only that, it's just like showing that queer people exist, showing that diversity exists, showing layers, and then eventually, if we are enough, we're gonna have more colorful and more fun streets.
And I think in a way that is I think you're completely right in terms of that availability not being there. And it kind of, your answer, Luca, I think really kind of comes back to the themes of your lecture, that you kind of, those keywords that you introduced in terms of there's like a class aspect, there's an aspect of capitalism, and it is essentially, to my mind, it is essentially, I think, about like demand and supply. And yeah, because there are, as you said, there are kind of genderless shoes that are available, but just at crazy price points, or in very limited supplies.
Very few. So hard for me. I have a 7. Sorry. It's also so hard for me. I have a 7, and it's not. He's kind of small feet for a man, and it's so hard to find the 7. Imagine if you are a 9 or a 10. In fact, all these shoes that I find are vintage or fancy dress, but fancy dress is not an actual shoe. It's going to fall apart after 2 weeks. So we have an issue for sure. But do we have a demand? Because we are all sort of led by the market in this world, right? Yeah, we don't want to, but we tend to. So do we have do we have the demand? It's also something about demand and offer. And how do you create the demand? You need to change society, I think.
Thank you for that talk. That was really lovely. I immediately thought of, when you were talking about platform, shoes about a specific pair I saw once in a vintage store that was made of plastic, and you could take it off to put water in it and presumably goldfish.
Yeah.
And I am thinking about now, like, every time, someone would wear those shoes, they're like literally have another animal below their feet, which actually is the same of us wearing heels. These are made of other materials from other plants, other animals. And I'm wondering if you could think about how your research, looking across different regions, different materials, how you've, explored the materiality of the heels, and if that's been a part of your process.
Yeah, absolutely. The heel has been a challenge throughout all the history, because it was a thing that didn't exist before. So they were trying to perfect it and do it in different ways. In the challenge response to your question as well, try to be comfortable and try to be gracious at the same time is not easy. I personally notice a lot of wooden eels. I've been quite interested in them. That's why I decided to study wood carving, to make some wooden heels, or anyway elements in my work with the wood. Is quite durable, can be, depend which wood you have, but can be also kind of light. Definitely is not light as cork. Cork is a very good other alternative. A very old school way is to just cut leather and stack it on top of each other, like layers, and it becomes really don't imagine the leather thin like this. Imagine that leather very thick, and then you just sort of build it that way. Yeah, I would say these are the most common kind of three type of material I found. So cork, leather, and wood. And then, of course, for the stiletto, there's metal, because you have a plaque in metal inside that's how the stiletto doesn't break. You have a metal.
Any more questions? Maybe two more, yeah.
Last two. We can continue later. The open studio.
Hi, I've got a question about your timeline of how things change. You could see some changes where new technology came in, new manufacturing methods, but thinking of the 70s where it was maybe a bit more subversive.
Yeah.
Were these large changes when we were in a societal place where we were free to be things, or were these rebellious things where we were being oppressed and used these as a way of fighting back?
This is a great question, and I think the 70s were, in fact, a quite problematic sort of period. For example, I think in Italy, we had what we called anni di piombo. That means like the lead years. When we had killings next to your door, and it was tough. We also had wars. It was not an easy time at all. So I think somehow. It was a reaction to a quite hostile past, first of all, but also present. So I think this kind of came about. But also we don't have to forget that 60s and the 70s economic growth in the Western world was very significant. So that means you could produce more. So more variety of shoes, more variety of goods, more variety of everything. So it's a kind of interesting time. I mean, all times are interesting, really. But yeah, I think a bit of both.
Luca, I have a question about artisan way of making shoes.
Oh, yeah.
So recently I was in Novara buying artisanal shoes, and the owner of this shop was complaining a lot that Italians are losing this stylish approach, the appreciation for artisanal and craftsmanship, because they want to wear flats, they don't want to wear heels, and most of all, they want to wear sneakers. Do you have the same feeling, the same view on the subject? What do you think will happen to the
artisanal craftsmanship shoemaking?
Well, this is a very sort of is an issue because, as you can imagine, sneakers can be produced very quickly at a very low cost, and they can also be bought at a very low price. So almost every one of us would have a pair of sneakers somewhere, and almost none of us would have handmade old school shoe like the one I'm making. I have it in my studio, half finished, or where you take 10 to 15 days, full days to make a shoe. How do you price it? Well, you have to price it, let's say 200 a day. Count it is, it's a lot of money. It's almost 3,000. So I think this is the problem. At the time, it was a long time ago. I'm talking about, we're going to have to go back, even before the 1950s, even before 1920s. Back at the time, the only way to make the shoe was to do artisanally. So there was no option. That means that the prices were different and the demands was different. And maybe someone ordered a shoe and waited for a while and then buy a shoe and use it for 5 years. And for us, it's harder that a shoe survives 1 year. It's quite difficult to survive 1 year because they're bad quality. And unfortunately, in my area, which is the north of Italy, Lombardy, but also in Tuscany, but also in Northampton. In Northampton, we had 250 factories making shoes in the golden days. Now we have 5 or 6. I mean, this tells. So, unfortunately, it's dying. The artisanal shoe is becoming a luxury. So the prices is going higher and only few people can afford it. But it's not dead because it's bad. It's actually great, a shoe handmade. And it's dead because capitalism started all this other type of production that exploit people, that decentralize the production, make it cheaper, but doesn't make it better. Make it cheaper. And this is that's why it's a sad story. Because, the product is really, the handmade product is really good. If you buy it, can last 10, 20 years, a pair of shoes. And if you count, maybe all the shoes you bought over the 20 years, you are gaining buying an artisanal shoe. But maybe you don't have on the spots 2,000 pounds. But if you do, you would have saved them for many years. But you could not change the style and the trend. So again, we have a lot of issues with the capitalism. But it's really fascinating, and I would recommend to anyone to watch some videos on YouTube of how they make the shoes. Traditionally, is amazing. It's so relaxing. It's like.
I think your lecture as well was such a kind of celebration and testament to how incredible that craftsmanship is and how incredible that tradition is and what kind of needs to be kept alive. Thank you for your questions and thank you so much, Luca. Please stick around.